Hey everyone, welcome to this explainer. You know, the Korean Peninsula literally sits right in the middle of East Asia's absolute biggest giants. It's just a single piece of land, but it holds this staggering story of resilience, division, and forced adaptation. So, we're diving straight into a really fascinating mystery today. How on earth did a single unified peninsula become the two most fundamentally different countries on Earth? We're going to look at how fear, survival, and geopolitics forced a unified people down two completely opposite paths. All right, here's our roadmap for today. We've got 1. A history of giants, 2. The peninsula divided, 3. North Korea, the fortress, 4. South Korea, the miracle, 5. K-pop and geopolitics, and finally, 6. The modern peninsula.
Let's jump right into Part 1, A History of Giants. Maneuvering between superpowers.
To really get Korea, you have to understand its historical neighborhood. It was rarely the center of the world, right? But it was almost always the center of conflict for the massive powers surrounding it. For like 1,000 years, they were a dedicated tributary state of China, even adopting the Chinese form of governance. But as China kind of lost its grip and Japan started rising, Korea was forced into this brief period of independence in 1895. And I mean brief. By 1910, they became a colony of the Japanese Empire. This era was absolutely brutal. Koreans were forced to take Japanese names, their resources were completely drained, and when the Japanese Empire finally fell in 1945, they left behind a nation totally stripped of its own administrative and technical expertise. They had been used and subdued.
Which leads us to Section 2, The Peninsula Divided, a nation torn apart.
So, World War II ends, the Japanese leave, and the cold, hard reality of geopolitics sets in. Once again, Korea's fate is decided by outsiders instead of its own people. The US and the Soviet Union had to figure out what to do with the territory. And get this, without consulting a single Korean expert, 2 young US officers literally just grabbed a National Geographic map and drew a line right across the 38 parallel. Boom! That one arbitrary line permanently tore apart a peninsula that had been unified for over millennia.
What happens next is basically a mirrored Cold War proxy battle. Up north, the Soviets installed Kim Il-sung, who quickly rolled out Soviet-style land reforms and set up a one-party state. Down south, the US backed Syngman Rhee, this staunch anti-communist leader, and they outlawed existing provisional governments just to maintain control. This super volatile setup inevitably ignited the devastating Korean War in 1950. Millions suffered. And by 1953, the war ended in an armistice, cementing the demilitarized zone and basically proving to both sides, yeah, we're not uniting again anytime soon.
All right, Section 3, North Korea, the fortress, looking at isolation as a survival tactic.
After the war, North Korea took a really hard look at its history. They realized, hey, relying on foreign giants, China, Russia, Japan, it always makes us vulnerable. So they developed this concept called Juche. Now, Juche isn't just some random political buzzword, it was a deeply logical, totally fear-driven response to a millennium of being exploited. It means absolute self-reliance. So instead of trading their abundant minerals for the food they desperately needed, the government just took total ownership of the economy to produce everything themselves. They wanted to guarantee they'd never be at the mercy of a foreign power ever again.
But, you know, the world changed. For decades, North Korea actually did lean pretty heavily on the Soviet Union for financial and tech aid to kind of prop up that Juche ideology. So when the Soviet Union completely collapsed in 1991, North Korea lost its biggest trading partner and its main source of aid overnight. Facing severe famine and terrified of a US-backed South Korean invasion, they had to adapt again. They pivoted to Songun, which translates to a military-first policy. The military literally took over infrastructure and energy, and the country poured whatever resources it had left into developing nuclear weapons. Because in a world where a struggling economy might invite rebellion or invasion, nukes were seen as the absolute ultimate guarantee of national survival.
But we can't forget the human element here. Despite the intense isolation, the heavy state propaganda, and the constant power outages, the citizens themselves are incredibly resourceful. To put it into perspective, today, an estimated 55% of North Korean households actually use homemade solar panels to generate their own power. Think about that. These are not uneducated or helpless folks. They are highly resilient individuals figuring out ways to survive, adapt, and even secretly watch smuggled foreign media.
Meanwhile, let's look at the other side in Section 4, South Korea, the miracle. State capitalism on overdrive.
So early South Korea actually faced the exact same existential threats as the North: rampant poverty, reliance on foreign aid, and severe corruption. To legitimize their rule, and frankly to stave off any communist sympathies, the authoritarian government realized they needed explosive wealth fast.
so they created chaebols. By backing these massive family-owned business conglomerates, the state essentially ensured corporate longevity. See, unlike companies chasing short-term shareholder profit, family businesses look decades ahead. The South Korean government effectively became more state capitalist than even the Japanese model they were copying. They handed these chaebols massive amounts of capital and completely shielded them from foreign competition.
And the government aggressively micromanaged them through something called indicative planning. They literally dictated industrial shifts. They banned LG from the textile industry and forced them into making electric cables. They threatened Hyundai with bankruptcy if they didn't immediately start building ships. And when international investors completely laughed at South Korea's plan to build a massive steel mill, especially since they had zero natural iron ore, the government just used Japanese war reparations to fund it anyway. This incredibly forceful top-down strategy is what magically forged the miracle on the Han River, driving just staggering economic growth.
To really grasp the immense power these conglomerates hold today, just consider this number: 20%. Today, Samsung alone accounts for an unbelievable 20% of South Korea's total national exports. That's huge! The lines between business and state became super blurred as these chaebols grew so massive that they were sometimes even more powerful than the law itself.
Which brings us to Section 5, K-pop and Geopolitics, or the cultural weapon.
As South Korea transitioned into this fully developed economy, they kind of hit a brick wall. In 1997, the Asian financial crisis completely halted their rapid economic boom. They desperately needed an entirely new export to survive globally. And that new export? Culture. Back in 1987, decades of heady media censorship had finally been lifted, so you had this newly traveling youth bringing global Western perspectives back home to Seoul. They forged this highly polished, totally dynamic entertainment industry. The government saw this happening and immediately threw all its weight behind Hallyu, or the Korean Wave. This was a strategic move to completely rebrand South Korea. They didn't want the world thinking about the Korean War or the financial crisis anymore. They wanted to be seen as modern, prosperous, and totally free.
The Samsung Research Institute actually developed a literal playbook for this. Step 1, create global buzz through K-dramas and K-pop. Step 2, monetize those specific cultural products. Step 3, leverage that massive new audience to sell other South Korean exports. Think high-end cosmetics, technology, and food. Step 4, enjoy a remarkably favorable national impression on the global stage. It absolutely proves that K-pop isn't just catchy music, right? It's a highly effective, carefully cultivated geopolitical weapon.
All right, wrapping up with Section 6, the modern peninsula parallel realities today. Let's bring this all back together. Today, both populations are navigating these radically different modern realities, but both show immense resilience. Up in North Korea, despite massive, life-threatening risks, citizens are secretly smuggling in USB drives to consume foreign media, seeing right through the state propaganda. Down in South Korea, citizens continuously take to the streets, protesting to dismantle corruption and preserve the democracy they fought so incredibly hard to win from their early military dictatorships. The people of both nations are far from passive. They're actively shaping their lives against the massive systems built around them.
So two nations, deeply shaped by a mutual fear of foreign dominance, took completely opposite paths to survive the giants around them. One built an isolated fortress, the other a globally integrated economic miracle. As they continually adapt, it leaves us with one really profound mystery to ponder. Will the shared memory of a unified Korea ever be enough to bridge this divide?